Три, два, один.
Zero. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
In this video series we are going to explore all the commonly presented evidences to prove that the Apollo missions were a hoax. However, there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding this topic, so our job will be to separate the weak evidences from the solid evidences, or what we like to call, the real smoking guns, from the not-so-smoking guns. So join us now on this adventure, as we go into the lies which NASA has told, in order to cover up the truth which they are trying to hide from us.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Smoking Gun series. Now, we've already put out part 1 and part 2, and responses to those videos has been actually quite good, quite positive and overwhelming. So I'm really pleased to hear the response and to read all your comments, and some of them are quite good. So please continue to do that, and we'll respond as much as we can accordingly, given our own schedules. But in this particular video, I would actually like to focus more on Rasa's background, because I think it puts this into better context for those that are watching this. And we did touch on that in part 1, but we didn't go as far as I would have liked to. So I'm going to ask Rasa to explain a little bit more and get into some details about his background and what led him to where he is now, in other words, his journey. And I'd actually like to start, Rasa, welcome back. I'd like to ask you, you had an actually very interesting start and very positive influence in your life in terms of your parents. I kind of like you to start there, because not all of us have had that positive influence. Talk about putting somebody on the right track, if you could start there.
Yes, I was very fortunate that my mother raised me up to be skeptical of the government. So before I tell my story, I would like to say that, first of all, this is not a popularity contest for me. Most people, when they hear my story, really hate me. Half the people are going to hate me, half the other people are going to think I'm making this up. And that's understandable, because my story is quite hard to believe. But, all I can tell you is just try to research the things I'm about to say, and then you'll come to the same conclusions I have. So I think the best way to do this, in my opinion, is first tell what it is that I have insider information about. And then the second thing is, how did I come to know that? So as I mentioned before, I am an insider, I am a whistleblower, I am revealing some inside information here. So the main things I'm telling you is that, first of all, China knows the moon landings were a hoax. And the second thing is, they have evidence that it was a hoax. They have photographs of the Apollo landing sites. And the third thing is, they actually have a deal with NASA. The deal is, if you guys don't blow the whistle on us, we will continue sharing technology with you. And that has been the deal ever since 1984. So it's difficult for many people to understand. A lot of people ask me, why isn't China blowing the whistle? And China's trying to maintain friendship. So this is the Chinese mentality. There's a saying in ancient Chinese philosophy. It says, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. So we're not trying to make enemies here with America. We're trying to keep friendship. The Chinese government agreed not to blow the whistle on the Apollo missions. Now, the second thing is, how did I come to know this information? So I was a university student in America. In 1999, I graduated from Portland State University, and I was majoring in astrophysics and quantum mechanics. And during that time, I was approached by several scouts. Different universities send scouts into my university. And many of these scouts were trying to recruit me to other universities. And one of them actually offered me a job at NASA. but I turned them down, because I said, no, I'm not interested. I'm leaving the country. And I went after that in 1999, I moved to India and I started studying medicine in India. So many people ask me, why do you have an Indian sounding name? It's because I'm actually a medical doctor who studied in India. But the interesting thing is, I was taking a trip to America in 2001, and I happened to be in New York City when 9/11 happened. And I started doing a lot of research at that time. Now, I want to mention the name of one person, which I think most everybody should try to find. His name is Mike Rupert. He did a series of lectures in 2001. This was just after 9/11. He's dead now, and I'm pretty sure they killed him. The official story is that he did suicide. But no, that's not. Anyway, why? So, because of these lectures he gave about 9/11, many people haven't heard his name. In fact, it's quite shadow banned. It's hard to find any of his videos now. But if you search hard enough, you can find it. But most importantly is in 2001, he gave a lecture about the insider trading just before 9/11. They were selling stocks in the airlines because they knew those were the airlines that were going to crash. So Mike Rupert is the famous guy who exposed these things. Now, Mike Rupert is an ex-LA police officer. He was in the narcotics division, and he quit the LA police because the CIA was trying to get him involved in the illegal drug trafficking. So he quit the LA. And he gave this series of lectures in 2001, just after 9/11. Here's the thing which I learned was that in 2001, as we all know, just the day after 9/11, the US troops invaded Afghanistan. Most people are aware of that. Just the very next day, the US troops invaded. They were already there waging it. But they invaded Afghanistan. Now the question is why? Why did just the day after 9/11 the US troops invade Afghanistan? Is because they were trying to cut off the Chinese oil pipeline. This is what I learned from Mike Rupert, and I was shocked to learn these things. So then I started doing more of my own research, and I found out that China does not have a private central bank. Since 1949, Chairman Mao kicked out the Rothschilds and all the Freemasons and all these things. If you look at it in the bigger picture, 9/11 was actually an attack on China because it was 6 days after 9/11, September 17, China joined the World Trade Organization. They had no choice because the US troops had cut off the pipeline, the oil pipeline they were trying to build in Afghanistan. Okay, so I learned about these things. Wow, China doesn't have a private central bank, and this 9/11 was actually trying to bring China back into the central banking cartel. So I moved to China in 2008. Many people ask me, are you a communist? They always call me these names like that. No, I'm not a communist. I'm not a member of the Chinese Communist Party or anything like that. I agree with them on many issues and disagree with them on some issues. But I'm not a Chinese nationalist or anything like that. But I do work with the government, okay? I don't work for the government because I'm not a member of the Communist Party, but I work with the government on a lot of different projects because of my background in quantum mechanics. I first learned about the NASA agreement in 2016. I was offered a job with the Chinese Space Agency in 2016. And when I went there, I asked them, I said, obviously, you guys know that no human being has ever stepped foot on the moon. And They said, of course we know that. And They said, we have an agreement with NASA not to blow the whistle. So the agreement goes like this: if you guys don't blow the whistle, we will continue sharing technology with you. And if you just wait for it, we will blow the whistle on ourselves. Okay? So this agreement was made in 1984. Okay, this was when China was admitted to the Outer Space Treaty of the UN. Okay, in 1984. If you just go to the Outer Space Treaty, you can see China was let in 1984, and this is where they made the agreement. From that time, the EU and the NASA were helping the Chinese space program from 1984. And they just said, look, we will continue supplying technology with you, just don't blow the whistle on the moon landings. NASA also said, we are going to admit it was a hoax just after Artemis 3. Okay, as soon as we can land a man on the moon for real, then we're going to admit that that was the first man. So China taking their word for it, they agreed to do that. That's the other reason why we're not blowing the whistle. Myself personally, I never agreed to not blow the whistle. You could say that here in China, it wouldn't be gentlemanly of me to be doing what I'm doing, you know, because there's an unwritten agreement among all Chinese space agency employees is that we just don't talk about these things. In the schools here in China, they do not teach that the moon landings were real, okay? It's not taught to children in schools here that human beings have stepped foot on the moon. So we just kind of avoid the subject. We don't say whether it's real or we don't say whether it's fake. There are many Chinese web pages which talk about it being fake, and there's even mainstream Chinese government documentaries about it being fake, but they don't publish that in English, you know. Anyhow, the point is, I only come onto YouTube and Facebook because these sites are actually banned by China, right? So I'm pretty much free to say whatever I want there because they're not monitoring this anyway. If I were to make my own Chinese webpage, right, then they would monitor that. And that would be ungentlemanly of me to do that in China, in Chinese. You know, us, the people who work for the Chinese Space Agency, we don't publicly expose it as a hoax.
Yeah. I have a question for you, Rasa, if you don't mind. So basically what you're saying is that you're not speaking for China nor the space agency, you're speaking for yourself. And that gives you some cover here, right?
Right. I could lose my job if they found out I was doing this, you know.
Okay.
Definitely. It's ungentlemanly of me because it's kind of an unwritten thing. We don't talk about it, the hoax, publicly in China anyway.
Okay. The other thing that I just want you to elaborate slightly on, we get back to the topic at hand here, and you mentioned the private central bank. There's probably some viewers out there, a lot of the viewers are really in tune with what you're talking about. For those that are not really understanding the importance of having a private central bank, pro or con, maybe you can just give a little bit of background on that.
Yes. As I mentioned, I'm quite a historian. My first book is about to be published about the history of the private central banks. And this is the most important thing because once a country has a private central bank, then all of the politicians are going to be puppets of that private central bank. The most important thing you could ever study is the history of the creation of the private central banks. You know, it all began in 1609 with the creation of the Dutch Republic, which was the first private central bank. And then the Dutch took over England in 1694. They created the first private central bank of England. And then in 1800 was the first private central bank of France. And then in 1893 was the first private central bank of Italy. And then they came to America. In 1913, as we all know, was the creation of the private central bank of America. And then they went to, of course, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was created, the private central bank, in 1917. And then Germany in 1918 was the creation of the Weimar Republic. And finally, in 1939 was the creation of the private central bank of Spain. So pretty much by that time, they had control over the whole world. Every country had a private central bank at that time by 1939. So I made a documentary about this. It's a really nice documentary in case you haven't watched it. But I didn't tell the full story there because I didn't talk about China, okay? China had a private central bank from 1912. The last emperor was kicked out of China, and then they created the private central bank of China in 1912, and that lasted until 1949. So you can say what Chairman Mao did was he did an Andrew Jackson on us. You know how Andrew Jackson ended the bank in America? That's where Chairman Mao figured out where all the problems were coming from. They were coming from the private central bank. Once the private central bank had destroyed the Chinese yen, the currency was devaluated, and like $100 couldn't buy you a loaf of bread. And Chairman Mao figured out it's all because of this private central bank. So in 1949, he ended the bank. That's why I decided I came to China in 2008 just for that reason. It's because I don't want to live in a country where it's run by a private central bank. I don't want to pay taxes to them. I don't want to support them in any way. It's the same reason why I turned down the job for NASA, because I don't want to work for any government agency in a country run by a private central bank.
And that too, I understand now, and I'm actually researching this myself. There's a connection between the JFK assassination and the Federal Reserve Bank.
Of course, he issued the silver certificates of the Kennedy dollars. And this was a direct attempt to end the Fed. It's the same thing that Lincoln tried to do when Lincoln issued the greenbacks. At the time of Lincoln, there was no private central bank, but he knew that they were trying to weasel their way back in. So when he issued the greenbacks, he was trying to end the coming back in of the private central bank. And of course, they shot him for that. And of course, Kennedy as well. He tried to issue those silver dollars. That was a big no-no. You don't try to end the private central bank.
No. And I believe, too, that Kennedy issued a formal bill through Congress on this very matter, in essence, was taking on the Federal Reserve. And I believe it was about 5 or so months before he was assassinated. So for people who are wondering at what point did they decide he had to go, that would be a pretty good reference point, correct?
Yes. There's also another key thing, was that he sent some weapons inspectors to Israel. They were searching whether Israel was only doing nuclear energy or whether they were also secretly doing nuclear weapons. And so Kennedy sent some weapons inspectors to Israel just a few months before he died. That was also a big no-no. Kennedy was concerned that Israel was not only building nuclear energy, but they were also secretly building nuclear weapons. So Kennedy sent in some weapons inspectors to Israel, and Israel was hiding all of their nuclear weapons manufacturing from those inspectors. Kennedy was in support of Israel, but he was not in support of them getting nuclear weapons. That was a big no-no. They wanted to have it, and they still have it today. This is the one thing that I agree with China on, is because China considers Israel a terrorist state. China has been supporting Palestine ever since Israel was created, and Palestine has been attacked ever since 1948. China has been like, wait a minute, who gives Israel the right to do this? Of course, as you know, China is a member of the UN. Let me just mention a couple of things. In 1975, it was called the UN Resolution 3379, which declared Israel an apartheid state, basically. This terrorism, what they're doing. So this was a UN resolution in 1975, and China was the main supporter of this. Let's be real here. What they're doing is apartheid. And then, of course, what happened in 1991, the UN passed a new resolution, the UN Resolution 4686. And that resolution said Israel is no more an apartheid state. And what they did was they made sure China was not there when they passed this resolution. Like I said, there's certain things I agree with China on and certain things I disagree with them on. And I could even get in trouble. I've mentioned that in certain interviews that, personally, I don't think that Tibet should belong to China. And I could actually get in trouble for saying that. That's a big no-no here in China. I mean, of course, I'm allowed to say that, but somebody who's working along with the government on certain projects, that would be ungentlemanly of me to say these things. So anyway, there's certain things I disagree on, like that, but there's other things I agree on. For example, I agree to ban pornography and many other things, like they don't allow gay marriage, and there's many issues I agree with them upon.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. I just wanted to fall back on something here, and it's about Israel. And it always struck me as a little odd that the United Nations, and there was a lot more behind the scenes goings on at the time, and I'm just giving a bare outline here. I always thought it was strange that they would set up not only a country for the Jewish people, but then put that country right in the heart of its enemies. That always struck me as being a little bit strange. And of course, common sense tells me that was done on purpose to destabilize the region.
Well, it's much more than that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
As you know, I just mentioned the history of the private central banks. One of the things these private central banks like to do is to fund both sides of a war. I mean, that's been going on ever since the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The Anglo-Dutch Wars was a series of wars fought between the Netherlands and England. It was the same bankers controlling both sides. That's going back until the 1600s, Yeah. So there's 400 years of the same bankers controlling both sides of every war. Now, why do they do that? It's not just for financial gains. No, it's much worse than that. The reason why they do that is because in their eyes, this is helping to fulfill messianic prophecy. The reason why these guys do that is because they believe in their hearts that war and bloodshed will help to usher in the return of the Messiah. This is all written in the book of Ezekiel. They're just following it, that book, play by play, okay? The book of Ezekiel is talking about the return of the Messiah, and the Messiah is going to return when the world is full of bloodshed and hatred and war and sexual degradation. They love these things. So that's why, when it comes to Palestine, they could have easily wiped Palestine off the map in 1948, but they didn't want that. They want to perpetuate the torture, the terror, the bloodshed, because in their eyes, that's going to help usher in the return of the Messiah.
Exactly. And that kind of also, we're getting into another area here, and I'm going to ask you, choose your words carefully just for the censors. Number one, Kennedy himself was warning of, and I think he warned people of this 10 days before he was assassinated, and that was secret societies. Because this is a big issue for me, and I think it is for you too, Rasa, and given your perspective where you are right now in China, and given your background and your perspective on, the politics of it all, the last 3 years, I kind of put that into the context of it came out in the open, if I could put it that way. So you got these Freemasonic societies, you got the Illuminati, you've got a lot of these that people scoff at, but are very, very real. And as you just said, they love numbers and rituals. It's very important to them. Specific dates, very important to them. That's why, because you see all these overtones and overlaying of Illuminati symbols within, let's say, the JFK assassination, because it's them signing their work. And they have to adhere by a certain tradition, whatever way you want to put it. They have certain rules that they have to go by themselves. For example, predictive programming, which we see in Hollywood. So if you could just maybe talk about that a little bit, the secret societies and how this all culminated in the last 3 years.
First of all, let me mention this. There is a book here in China. I don't know if you can see the English is here. It's called Currency Wars. If you go to Wikipedia, okay, and you just type in Currency Wars, and it's telling you about this Chinese book. Now, This Chinese book, it talks about the fact that the Federal Reserve Bank was illegally created in 1913, and these same bankers assassinated Kennedy. Okay? And so here in China, this is not considered conspiracy theory. This is considered conspiracy fact. And this book has been read by every member of the Chinese government. You can't get into the Chinese government until you've read this book. I mean, and this book is saying the Rothschilds created the private central bank of America. They killed Kennedy. And it also mentions 9/11. And they mention the Freemasons. There's an interesting thing. The date, 9/11, September 11th, okay? That date is a Freemasonic holiday. So September 11th was an event that happened called the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where a Scottish knight by the name of William Wallace defeated the British, and this enabled the Freemasons of Scotland to survive. So they consider September the 11th like their birth date. With the attacks of 9/11, it was no coincidence that they chose this date to be the establishment of the New World Order. And also, the name of the two pillars of the Twin Towers was Boaz and Joachim. This is Freemasonic. There's two towers in every Freemasonic temple. So these two towers, they represent chaos and order. So these are the two pillars which holds up the heavens, Boaz and Joachim. These are the name of the two pillars in every Freemasonic temple. And the coming down of the pillars, the coming down of the Twin Towers, there's a Freemasonic symbolism here. It means that the old order of establishing heaven is no longer needed because the new world order has already been established. Okay? The two towers held up the heavens, but once the two towers come down, that old system of order isn't needed anymore because the new world order has already been established. So these are fully Freemasonic symbolisms. The creation of the Twin Towers, the coming down of the towers, and you can see, like a Disney and all these others were showing the symbolism of the towers coming down, and even Hitler, he went to
Vimy Ridge
to visit the Twin Tower temple there in
France.
I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Well, I haven't seen it, no, but that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a Twin Tower. I think it's a World War I museum.
That is fascinating.
So coming back to my point, in China, this is not considered conspiracy theory. This is considered conspiracy fact. All this stuff, how the Rothschilds illegally created the Fed, this is what China is trying to prevent. We're trying to fight for our freedom here. We don't want to have a private central bank. I mean, this was what the Korean War was about. China was trying to help North Korea free themselves from the private central bank of South Korea. And this is also what the Vietnam War was about. China was also trying to help Vietnam escape from their private central bank, but it didn't work.
Some people are going to label you, and I want to clarify this. Some people are going to label you a communist for saying that. So, be prepared for that. And I thought I would just bring that up because you have a counter argument to that accusation. And I'd just like you to give that counter argument.
Well, first of all, many people don't know that Karl Marx was expelled from Germany. He had to go live in England, where he had to live the rest of his life out, basically in hiding. He couldn't even speak English, and he wasn't allowed to publish any more books. So he was banned from Germany. And the reason he was banned from Germany was because he did not agree with the communists who were planning on launching the Bolshevik Revolution. So when you say the word communism, we're talking about Bolshevik communism. Bolshevik communism was created by the same bankers who created the private central bank of America. The Bolsheviks, Trotsky, and they were all puppets. They were put in place, given money by the bankers in America to launch the Bolshevik Revolution. And the first thing they did was they created the private central bank of the Soviet Union in 1917. So this is why Marx was actually against communism. That's why he was expelled from Germany, because he knew that they were planning on doing this. And he said, this is not the communism I want to create. So my definition of communism is Bolshevik communism, which is just a puppet show. America versus the Soviet Union, this was just a puppet show. You know, it's the same bankers controlling both sides. Like I said, I'm not a communist, I'm not a Marxist. I'm just a person who studies history, and I'm a person who wants to live in a country which doesn't have a private central bank, you know, and I hope that more and more countries will free themselves from the clutches of this.